All right, so we're on the model of the leg, and this big muscle that we have here is one of my landmarks to put this on. And so this is gluteus maximus. This is one of my big landmarks for the posterior side. And then, of course, you can use the direction of the foot to go anterior and posterior. With left and right, the little toe is going to give you an idea of like what's lateral and what's medial. Big toes are medial, little toes are lateral, and so this is a left leg. If you did not remember that for the whole, that all the arms and the legs are lefts. Okay, so this is where we're going to get a little bit of a flip-flop with movement, because in the leg, remember, we've got for the thigh a situation where we've got basically the anterior muscles doing flexion at the hip and the posterior muscles doing extension at the hip, like we would think was correct from what we've talked about for the patterns everywhere else. But when we get into the lower leg in this like calf area, that's where it's going to flip-flop. And so this becomes the basically muscles that extend at the knee or help flex, dorsiflex the foot. And then back here, this is where we're going to point our toes or plantar flex the foot, and then basically do flexion of, at the knee. And so this is kind of where those compartments are going to flip-flop for future reference. Okay. Now, starting with muscles of the hip, in the hip area, and I'm going to leave this one on the front for right now. I'm going to talk about that with the rest of the muscles of the anterior thigh. Okay. A landmark that goes down the lateral side of the leg is this very, very big white band of tendon called the fascia lata. Okay. And so the fascia lata is actually a thickening of a bunch of fascia or connective tissue that goes all the way around the leg, is kind of like support hose. So you know how support hose kind of like helps return blood back to your head and makes it so that people can, you know, be on their feet longer because it helps improve circulation. So what it's doing is it's helping squeeze and support the veins to support the venous return to the head. So the fascia lata is actually a connective tissue sheath that goes around your whole lower leg, and it's called the lata because it's white, like a latte. It's milk-like. And so the fascia lata gets named because it's this kind of really thick band of tendon that's to the side, and it is that thickening or that band that kind of helps support some of the lateral muscles of the thigh. Okay. And you can use that as a landmark. And there are attachments underneath it to some of the muscles of like the quadriceps, and then also gluteus maximus kind of blends in with that. So this is gluteus maximus. It's our biggest muscle for extension at the hip. And so if you tighten your glutes, right, your leg kicks backwards, and that helps kind of tighten the buttocks. Okay, and so this is your biggest muscle in your rear end. Okay, so gluteus maximus underneath it has two other muscles that do the same thing. They're synergists, but then they help a little bit more with abduction as well, so moving the leg away at the hip. And so that's gluteus medius, and then underneath this, what you can't see is gluteus minimus. So medius and minimus are abductors, so abductors of the hip, so moving the leg out, as you would expect, because notice they're kind of more towards the outside of that joint. And so if it shortens, the leg's going to kick out that way. Okay. Now, underneath that, there's a landmark muscle that's really, really good for both the inside of the hip, if you ever have to do that anatomy, and then also the outside. And this muscle is called piriformis. Okay, piriformis is a very, very important muscle because, as you can see, the sciatic nerve comes out right underneath it. And so this very much acts like a little staging board for that muscle. And piriformis and the muscles underneath it, which are the superior gemellus, and then skipping one in between, the inferior gemellus, and then this is obturator externus, and there's actually an obturator internus that you don't see. So it goes gemellus, obturator that you don't see. And then there's another one down here called pronator quadratus. So these muscles all help with that abduction and rotation. So these are going to counter the group of muscles that are on the inner thigh. So these are the ones that, you know, you push out with your leg in the gym, or like, you know, do side splits. And these are the muscles that you're using to lift your leg out and to the side. Okay. They also, because they're doing abduction, they're also situated to do a little bit of lateral rotation. So they kind of aid with that as well. But it's mostly going to be the abduction of the hip. Okay. So we've got piriformis, superior gemellus, obturator externus, inferior gemellus, and then the one that you don't see is obturator internus. And then this big one that looks like a big square is pronator quadratus. Okay, and that's going to rotate the toe outwards. Okay. All right, so those are the muscles of the hip, but you can see to do extension of that hip, man, you need a big gluteus maximus, and so that's part of the reason why to get upright, we have such big gluteal muscles, but like a dog or a cat, their gluteal muscles are like eeny meeny and pretty much non-existent because they don't have to support their whole weight on their extended lower limb like we do. We get the badunk-dunk in the rear end because we are upright as animals. So we're back and we're going to be talking about the muscles of the thigh this time. And this is where it can get a little bit confusing because in some of your atlases and stuff like that, it'll be like flexion of the hip or flexion of the thigh at knee. So this is the thigh, right? But when we talk about flexion of the thigh, sometimes it's like referring to the knee joint, and just be able to go back and forth between those two. If we're talking about flexion of the hip, it's usually its own thing, but flexion of the thigh usually refers to the thigh at the knee, okay? And so this is another part where our flexor compartment is gonna be on the anterior side, so towards our toes, and the extensor compartment is still gonna be on the posterior side, like what we're used to. And these muscles are in big groups, which is kind of nice. And our lower limb, you know, is kind of organized very nicely for us that way, okay? And then remember, the lateral side is going to have that fascia lata, or that white fascia, that also serves as a landmark, okay? And so if you take a minute to get your anterior, posterior, lateral, and medial down, then this becomes very straightforward, okay? So to do the anterior muscles first, and these anterior muscles are going to be doing two things because they're so long. They attach to above the hip, and then they attach, in a lot of cases, below the knee. And because of that, most of them are going to move, except for like the short ones, are going to be moving both the hip joint and the knee joint, okay? And they're going to be causing, if you kind of picture these shortening, they're going to be causing extension at the knee and then flexion at the hip, because remember, those two things are going to be opposite, okay? So if we extend at the hip, we're going to flex at the knee, and if we extend at the knee, we're going to flex at the hip, okay? And so the anterior muscles, which do flexion at the hip and extension at the knee, include the quadriceps. And so the quadricep group include quadriceps femoris, okay, and then vastus medialis, which is this big one because it's vast, and vastus lateralis because it's big on the medial side. And then if we pick this up, the fourth one is hiding, and this is vastus intermedius because it's in between, okay? So quadratus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis, and then vastus intermedius is underneath, okay? And those all do flexion at the hip and extension at the knee. And because it does flexion at the hip and extension at the knee, it can also do a little bit of lateral rotation, as you would expect for things that are kind of more on the outside of the bone. The other muscle that helps with that lateral rotation and actually helps stabilize the knee for extension is this little tiny muscle, which is attached to the fascia lata, which is sometimes called the TFL or the tensor fascia lata, because it tenses the fascia lata. So it stabilizes this part so that in turn the quads are stabilized and you can get a stable extension at that knee. Okay. It also helps with lateral rotation, so rotating the toe out at the hip joint. And so all of that you would expect from all of this being on this kind of anterior and then the lateral side of the leg. Okay. Now doing the medial rotation and adduction, so adding the leg together, you get a group of muscles on the inside of the leg that are like, in most women, like the inner thigh pooch, right? When you do that, you try to do the inner thigh muscles as much as possible. These are your adductors, okay? And the adductors include a muscle that comes across like this, which is sometimes called the Taylor's muscle, because you use it to squat and put your knees together when you're squatting in a squatting position. So like if you were like catching in baseball or something like that, it keeps your knee stabilized. And so this is sartorius because it's the Taylor's muscle, okay? We've also got one that drops straight down. This is adductor gracilis, okay? And so that keeps kind of everything adducting towards the medial side, okay? And then also we've got a few other adductors in here that are kind of underneath. And so basically, this muscle that we can see in the front is ad longus, so adductor longus. And then we've got this big muscle that kind of hides, but it kind of goes very, very deep. And this is adductor brevis. Okay. So, or excuse me, adductor magnus, I should say, because it's the one that is going deep and it actually wraps all the way around the thigh in a lot of cases. So that's the biggest one that you've got. So this one is generally considered the prime mover for adduction. So that's ad magnus. All right, so to repeat for all of the adductors, okay, so the adductors, we've got sartorius, okay, we've got gracilis, and then we've got adductor longus and adductor magnus, okay? And because there is a longus, there is a brevis, but it's kind of like in here. You don't have to worry about that one, okay? And by the way, this little bit up here that forms this little triangle with the femoral artery, vein, and nerve, this is actually the other part of iliopsoas. So remember that muscle that was in the abdominal region and the back that helped with flexion at the hip? And so that's where iliopsoas attaches, okay? All right, so that is the adductors. And so those are all ones that do adduction at the hip and then also can do a little bit of medial rotation at the hip as well because they're on the inside of the bone, so it allows them to kind of use those two movements together. Okay. Now, lastly but not leastly, and I'm going to take my gluteus maximus off to do the hip muscles because you can see that glute max kind of covers them up pretty good, or the top parts of them anyways, the superior side. We've got the hamstrings, and the hamstrings all work to do two things. So they extend the leg at the hip, kind of synergizing with the glutes a little bit, and they also help flex the knee. And so basically kick the calf up kind of towards your butt, okay, or towards the gluteus maximus, shall we say, okay. And so with these ones, there are two muscles on each side, and one muscle's got two heads and the other one has two in there. And so basically, like, the way that I keep it straight is that on the lateral side, that's where you got the biceps. So this is the biceps femoris, okay? Different than biceps brachii, but it does have two heads, okay? And then on the medial side, this is where you get superficially semitendinosus and semimembranosus, which is kind of the deeper one that's a little bit more medial. So membranosus is a little bit more medial, so that's how I remember that. So semitendinosus, semimembranosus, and then the other two-headed one is the biceps femoris. And these all do that same action again of kind of like helping with thigh extension, but then also basically flexion at the knee. Okay. And those are your hamstrings. So anything that kind of makes you kick your heel towards your butt and extend your leg at the same time at the hip, that's going to be a hamstring exercise.
Yeah.
All right. So for the calf, and this kind of bottom part of the foot, it kind of goes along the same lines as kind of like the forearm muscles in the hands, but the compartments have flipped around. And so now the extensor compartment is on the anterior side, and then the flexor compartment is on the posterior side. And this is because the muscles back here are going to plantar flex, so moving your toe more pointed, and kind of cause your toes to flex and crunch up. And then the muscles on the anterior side are going to be involved in dorsiflexion, which is moving the top or the dorsum of your foot towards your knee, and then also extending your toes. Okay, so this is the extensor and dorsiflexion compartment. This is the flexor and plantar flexion compartment, okay? And then we'll see that some of the muscles to the sides are going to be used in inversion and eversion. And so inversion, right, would be like moving your foot so that it's more canted inwards like that. And then this would be kind of doing the eversion, or canting your foot outwards at the ankle, okay? And so kind of a big line, quite literally, that is here is your tibia. And so the tibia is a very bare part of your calf. This is the reason why, you know, like when you hit your shin on something, it doesn't feel that great. It's because that tibial bone is really, really very bare underneath your skin right there. And that actually can serve as kind of a landmark between the compartments. The other thing for right, left, or medial lateral that you want to keep in mind is your toes. So again, this is a left leg because the big toe is medial and the little toe is lateral. And that's going to be the same on both feet. But if you've got, you know, your right foot or your left foot, you can figure that out pretty quick. So take a minute to get your orientation. These are left legs, and then you're going to start working from there, okay? And so I'm going to flip this over first, because for me, the biggest, meatiest part of the leg is the easiest to start with these three muscles that they call the triceps surae, that are on the back and form like the meat of your calf. And these all kind of come together to form your Achilles tendon, okay? And so, and then that attaches to your talus. And so like what you guys learned about before. And so in Greek mythology, right, this was the tendon that supposedly Achilles' mother, to make him, he was a great warrior, to make him immortal, she dipped him into the river, I think it was Lethe, by his heel, by holding him by basically his Achilles tendon. So basically all of Achilles went into the water except for this little bit on the back of his heel. So that was the only part that could kill him. And then of course during the Trojan War, he gets shot in the heel by somebody and then he dies. And so that's why it kind of gets named after him. But oh, sorry, this is called the calcaneal tendon as its other name. And so I said talus a little bit earlier, but that was incorrect. So this is the calcaneal tendon because it attaches to the calcaneus, which then attaches to the talus. I got a little bit ahead of myself. So basically, this is the other name for the Achilles tendon, is the calcaneal or calcaneal tendon. Okay. And so that's where all these triceps surae like insert. And so you want to be able to name them specifically. And so this one that's most superficial has two bellies to it. And belly, another name for it is gastro, right? Which is how you name your stomach, right? And so this is a double bellied muscle, and it's called gastrocnemius because basically it's got two big bellies to it. And so it's got a medial belly and a lateral belly. Okay, and this is both gastrocnemius. Gastrocnemius is actually, if you pay attention to your muscle physiology, and you guys have learned about, you know, like the white meat and the dark meat, so the short twitch fibers and the long twitch fibers, and the short twitch are more of like your kind of sprinting muscles, and then the long twitch or dark meat is like more of your like basically like your endurance, like your long-term running type of muscles. So gastroc is actually a muscle that's very big in sprinters. It's one that's largely white meat and basically those short twitch fibers. The one that's underneath it, if we lift this up, has a single belly, and it has a very, very long tendon, which to me looks like a fillet of sole. And so you can see it this way, or if you take off the whole triceps surae, it's the one that the whole belly goes underneath. And this is soleus. Okay. And so this whole muscle that's underneath the medial head, in this case on this model of the gastrocnemius, is soleus. And soleus is the long twitch muscle, so the dark meat. And those two work together to kind of support the foot as we're kind of bending the foot during running. And so like we talked about before, this is going to cause plantar flexion of the foot, and then also flexion of the toes. So it helps us grab the dirt or whatever we're running on in order to stabilize our foot. Okay. Now this big long tendon that's back here, this is what some people in gross anatomy call the freshman nerve, because this is actually a tendon to a little tiny muscle up here called popliteus. And popliteus is kind of a little wussy muscle that's used for a little bit of stability at the knee. But because that tendon is very shiny and it's pretty big and flat, people want to like call it, freshmen in medical school want to call it a nerve all the time. And so that's why it's called the freshman nerve. So if you guys go to further school, don't call it that. But I would not tag this, but just so you know, like, what's the deal with this thing? It's actually a tendon from a muscle that's up here. Okay, so we're going to take those gastrocnemius and the soleus off. Okay. And then we're seeing in here three deeper muscles. 1, 2, 3. Okay. And these three deeper muscles are going to be the ones that attach to these tendons down here by the heel. And so you can see that this is on the medial side. And so these three muscles, when they contract, they're going to cause not just flexions of the toes, but they're going to cause inversion of the foot. Okay. And so these ones are, because they're all three together and they have names that start, or in their names, they start with TD and H. They are called in anatomy sometimes the Tom, Dick, and Harry muscles. And actually, where they insert and the way that their tendons go, they go in that order. So Tom, Dick, and Harry. But they cross over each other because Dick's a double cross or Dick's a real dick, right? And so that's the reason why the muscle bellies are in a little bit of a different order up here. And so you want to be careful when you're going through it, because what it is that Tom's in the middle. So this is tibialis posterior. And then you've got flexor hallucis longus. So this is Harry. And then flexor digitorum longus that's on the outside. So that's Dick. Okay, so tibialis posterior, flexor hallucis longus, flexor digitorum longus. Okay, Tom, Dick, and Harry. These three are what cause inversion of the foot and a little bit of plantar flexion. Okay. But those are the deepest in your posterior compartment. Okay. Now I'm going to put this back on, and then I'm going to talk about the lateral compartment a little bit, because these are going to be the muscles that allow for eversion of the foot. So moving the foot out to the side at the ankle, and then also some dorsiflexion. Okay, so these are still considered a little bit of anterior muscles, but they're kind of lateral because of the way that they are. And there are two of them, and they overlap, and you can kind of see them down here. The tendon kind of joins together, but in real life, it's actually usually a tendon that comes up here and a tendon that goes a little bit shorter. This big long one is peroneus, also called fibularis, because the fibia is right here. Fibularis longus. And I learned it as fibularis longus. Peroneus is an older name. Okay. So this is fibularis longus, and then where they've got the number for this one, it's supposed to look like a separate muscle belly, and it is. It's actually deep, but the way that they stamp this is a little bit weird. But this is peroneus brevis, and brevis would be underneath, and it would actually usually have like a separate tendon coming down that inserts into the same place. But you can see if you shorten this, you would cause the side of the foot to kind of tilt out like that, and so that's what causes the eversion of the foot. Okay. And then also a little bit of flexion of the toes, particularly the digiti minimi. Okay. But it'll help stabilize the toe extension from this muscle right here. And so this is extensor digitorum. Okay. Again, kind of like the extensor digitorum on your hands. This is the extensor digitorum on your foot, and so it's going to cause all your toes to kind of flex and splay, and depending on, I said flexor a couple times, I meant extensor. So this is extensor digitorum, and similar to the extensor digitorum on your hand, depending on the tendons here, it's going to cause, again, extension of your toes, either separately or together. You can tell just by a little bit of my mistakes in here that it's really easy to make mistakes if you're going too fast, if you don't think through the names. So make sure that you're slowing down and you're thinking through the names, because the names will help you out, same as in the forearm. Okay. Now, this last one that's kind of midline here is one of my favorite muscles. And this one in the middle is going to be kind of echoing the one that was the Tom, Dick, and Harry. So that was tibialis posterior down here. This is tibialis anterior, and tibialis anterior attaches to the carpal bones, and it allows you to basically dorsiflex your foot, but then also turn your toe inward. And so basically like dorsiflect and medial rotate your foot. The reason I like this muscle so much is because if you've done any martial arts, you know that if you break boards or you do like any side kick or anything like that, you have to flex your foot and rotate it inwards to protect your toes while you're breaking. So this is the black belt muscle, because anybody who's got like a black belt who's been doing that a lot, you actually get this like little divot that leads up to your knee, because it's like your tibialis anterior kind of turning inward. Okay. And so that is your tibialis anterior. Sorry, I think I was kind of running my finger like that, but then to be more specific, it's this one, okay, because it's attaching up here. Now, a deeper one that you might see here, this is basically extensor hallucis coming out from underneath to do the big toe, but you don't have to worry too much about that one, okay? But this is tibialis anterior that goes with the tibialis posterior, okay? The black belt muscle. All right. And then as far as muscles in your foot, there's a few of them, but you don't have to worry about those. You just have to worry about the ones that we've pointed out. And so let me know if you've got any questions, and I will see you in class.